history has played in contemporary culture and in the contemporary injuries that we see. First thing that people have said to me, because it's interesting the pushback you get whenever you're talking about history. You get pushback. Oh, Pete, get over it, huh? You people, who are you trying to blame now? What excuses are you people trying to make? I wasn't there. And you're free now, aren't you? You know, it's like when you say slavery, it evokes such, visceral response in people. Visceral, like how dare you even say the words, and all of that comes out just for saying the word slavery. Just, I dare you. Go out in public and say it. They'll take you down. But you can say Holocaust. Isn't that interesting? Matter of fact, they got 3 new movies coming out. 3 new ones. See, so if you get confused, Spielberg will make another one. See, because they're not confused about their Holocaust. They honor their Holocaust. And we don't honor ours, largely because we don't know what of our Holocaust. We don't understand what it is. And I believe this, and the work that I'm looking at right now has to do with the role that shame plays with us as a people. We just don't want Mr. Jimmy to think we complaining. Oh, heaven forbid I seem like a victim. All of these things come up the moment we talk about our history. Those are the shoulders we stand on. Yes. How is it that we feel such, One of the things that happened to me recently is I went to Ghana. And I just got back from Ghana, in fact. And I took 3 days off to go spend with my brother, Oscar DeGrue, in Los Angeles so that I could get spiritually recentered, so I can get up and talk to folk. That's how deep Ghana was. Ghana was so deep that I would have written the book differently had I known what I learned in Ghana. And what I learned in Ghana is you've been lied to. You've been bamboozled. You've been hoodwinked. You've been had. And I know that on a level I've never known it before, because you see, I had a chance to see us unspoiled. I went into the villages. I looked into the faces of the people who lived in villages, and I went all through the different cities, and I looked at, and I went, oh my God, we don't know who we are. You see, we bought the lie, and we've become it. It is, I can't even tell you, I can't go there, because I go to another place. So I'm going to start with, the numbers, first of all, of those who got to the slave castles. This is Cape Coast Slave Castle. We don't have any numbers, and they were marched from the interior to the coast. People who had never seen the ocean or heard its roaring. And we don't know how many died on the way through exhaustion. We don't know how many were beaten to death and how many died fighting back. We don't know. And we later found out that those that didn't make it were held there sometimes over a year in these dungeons. Now, this is a male slave dungeon, and I'm giving you this picture so you can see there's no running water. I know you've heard about the dungeons, but it's really different when you're standing in them, where you can still smell the stench, because there is, of course, only there's a little, latrine. You can't see it in this picture, where it's just a little, where all the feces and urine and everything else just kind of was just there with you. Now, this is what it looked like when the light was on. This is what it looks like when the light is off. Those 3 holes there are the only source of light and ventilation for these spaces, where hundreds of people were packed. I want you to look at this. This is UNESCO discovered this when they were trying to renovate the castle for public viewing. They were trying to dig into the earth, couldn't figure out why they couldn't level it, and they were digging through 2 feet of human waste that had solidified. Now, the thing that's difficult, that made it difficult for me, was who these folks believed they were. This is Elmina Castle. This is a death cell. Now, let me kind of give you, this was a cell when men refused to be slaves. This is where you were put. And once you were put in this cell, you knew you weren't coming out, hence the crossbones. you were going to die there. So they stopped giving you water or food. That big hole that you see there is not for that particular cell. The only source of ventilation are the tiny holes that you see in the door. There's no other source of ventilation. So people would thirst, starve, and suffocate to death. That's how they die. And I don't have a slide here of the carvings in the floor, but they carved what almost looks like art as they were dying, crying out to the ancestors to rescue their souls from this place. Now this is the cell next door, which is for the white soldiers who were held for 24 hours. Notice the latticed door. That big huge hole is their window. There's another one on the other side. This is where they were held for 24 hours. So they made it very, very clear what was important. Now, when I was looking at the women's slave dungeon, let me just kind of explain to you why I needed my brother to work with me when I left. I had a couple of meltdowns. The first meltdown I had was when we got to the female death cell. And normally these were women who fought back and refused to be raped. Now, I wasn't prepared for this, none of this. You know, you cannot prepare yourself for this. And it was a mixed group that went in. I didn't know there was going to be a mixed group of folks going in, okay? And I probably could have been okay with that because there were a couple there. There was a white couple there that just, well, shut up. They didn't say anything. And you could see in their faces and in their bodies that they were impacted by this. But then there were others who didn't get that cue. So we got to the female death cell. There was an older white couple. And as the historian was explaining how these women died and the conditions under which they lived, this older white woman said, yes, but look at the architecture. You see, because she felt like, this is where the meltdown occurred, because I told her, you don't get to do that. And I also said, I should have an option to not have to be here with her. And they said to me, they apologized, they said, we actually do have a tour where you don't. I said, I would have preferred that. Because she couldn't be appropriate. Let me explain what was going on. Her privilege said to her, this is uncomfortable for me. I am on another continent. And I'm getting ready to tell you what direction this is going to move in. Because this is uncomfortable for me. That's how far-reaching the privilege was, you see. So I had a few problems with that. This particular slide is at Elmina, and these are the stairs leading from the bedroom of the governor. Let's get it clear. Directly into the female slave. This goes to his bedroom. Now, this is a Christian man. His family lives there with him, because we were, of course, visited those quarters too. But he wanted to have complete access to those black women who did not receive baths, anything. He said, clean that one up for me. And it wasn't enough for him to bring them in the back door or, you know, some other way. He had it built so he had free access. You following me? This was one of the things they would actually chain black women to who resisted being raped in a public square, and they would literally die chained naked to this ball because they fought back. And I'm putting this forward to you not for you to feel all achy and weird inside. I want you to understand the context of how this thing happened and how people could retain a sense of dignity through it all. We've seen this slide so much it's almost like a cartoon. This is the size. This actually is the size of a high school auditorium stage, not too much, about this size. And it is where they all were packed like sardines together. And you know, like I said, when I talk about numbers, how many Jewish people died during the Holocaust? You see how well you know that? I'm not mad that you know that, because you were taught that. It's been etched into your memory forever. And you have never gotten a lesson, I can guarantee you, about the numbers that died during the Middle Passage of slavery. You didn't get a class about that. I can guarantee you learned that far later. Even the books that publish it have only been published of late. even though we know there was documentation based on ship manifests of the numbers that died. And there's no number, again, like those who walked from the interior to the west coast. So we know the low figure, and this is in the Communist Manifesto, if you want to see it, is 9 million. That's the lowest figure on record. How could we not know? And then we have to understand why they died in such numbers, because this place was about 18 inches between people. This is where they slept. It's where they wept. It's where they ate. It's where they defecated. It's where they urinated. It's where they menstruated. It's where they vomited. It's where they sometimes gave birth and died. 18 inches of space between them. There is not a plaque. There's not a statue. There's not a day of remembrance for them. Those on whose shoulders you stand. How can that be? Even now, 2008, with the apology intact, you have no acknowledgement, and there is a reason for that. We start with James. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here with him. I'm going to tell you, because I tell everyone everywhere I go, and I just spoke in Bermuda where they all look like this when they get together. You should always be concerned when you see folks dressed this way. It's just a general experience I've had. If you see them dressing up like this, something wrong. And so one of the things that I realized about, about this whole idea of slavery, because the pushback you get around slavery is, let me give you a few of them because I know you get them. Well, one, of course, you're free, and that's questionable, but let's look at the whole idea that people say, well, slavery's not a new institution. Other people have had slaves, So why are you tripping? Slavery's not new. However, American chattel slavery does not have a likeness. It's not like. So this slavery is far different from any of the sense of slavery that existed prior to it. It differed in the manner in which a person became a slave. It differed in the treatment of slaves. It differed in the length of servitude. And most of all, it differed in the way owners treated their slaves, or their whole belief about their slaves. And part of that way of looking at the slaves had to do with dehumanization, different than other forms of slavery. Most people who became slaves in other societies became slaves as a result of war. Two societies went to war, the winners enslaved the losers. Sometimes in a case like Rome, where you had a more dominant society, would make war on a weaker state and steal the manpower. Europeans, however, systematically turned the shipping, capturing, selling of other human beings into a business that would develop into the backbone of an entire economy, providing the foundation for the world's wealthiest nation. That is different. And we need to be very, very clear about that it's about power and money. It was then, and it is now. Never changed. And we have to understand that in the context. And when you read this statement, this was basically the Three-Fifths Compromise. And the Three-Fifths Compromise wasn't too different from what happened in Florida. Because here's what happened. In the Constitutional Convention, they were trying to figure out, this was an opportunity to abolish slavery. Of course, the Southerners wanted to keep it because they were slave owners, Northerners. It wasn't really about trying to, can we all get along? It had to do about money and power. They saw this opportunity to abolish slavery. One state was the only state that decided it wasn't going to go along with abolishing slavery. It would not be part of the Union if they abolished slavery, which curtailed the whole discussion and tabled it, making slavery legal under the Constitution. Does anybody know which state that was? Carolina, South Carolina, yeah. They were the ones that couldn't. And so they basically were stalemated. So now the issue was, how are we going to count slaves into the population count? Now consider this. Delegates considered the more people represented in a state, the more delegates they can send to the House of Representatives, the more power they can wield, right? Well, of course, Southerners wanted to add the slaves. Northerners saying, you can't add them, you don't even include them as human. How do you do that? So the three-fifths compromise is rather than each slave being counted as a person, 3/5 of a state's total slave population were counted in that total population, and this way African people of African descent, enslaved Africans, became 3/5 of a human. Just that quickly, you see. But you can barely see in these writings that this is a human being you're talking about. This becomes very important as we move forward. Richard Oswald, another one of those people, I call him an absentee slave owner. This is the son of a Presbyterian minister, international trader of enslaved Africans, majority shareholder in Vance Island, dominant figure in Grant Oswald and Company, you should look that up, amassed a fortune that would be worth $68 million today. That's how well he did. He never left home, so he could stay dressed up like that. Then we have this fellow. You all know him, right? Best known for? Yes. I wanted to know how he was before he founded that Amazing Grace, because it took him a long time to find that amazing grace, let me just tell you. And let me give you an idea, an understanding. Most of you are familiar with our work, know that part of my question as a social scientist is how did a people who deem themselves superior, moral, intelligent, and civilized engage in barbaric behavior for centuries? How does one reconcile that opposing perspective? And here's what I do know, and I know my fellow mental health people in the audience know, that human beings in general cannot function with too much internalized conflict. Hence, something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is what it sounds like. Cognitive thinking discord. When people are faced with stuff that conflicts internally, they get all twisted. So we have to reconcile any conflict that's going on mentally, emotionally, spiritually, internally. Anything inconsistent with my beliefs and my behavior. Now, Dr. Edwin Nichols, most of you, if you haven't heard of Dr. Edwin Nichols, you need to bring him in. Dr. Nichols studied for many, many years. He is now in D.C. He pioneered work in something called the philosophical aspects of cultural difference. He talked about, and he's a retired industrial psychologist, wrote his dissertation in German. I can tell you a little bit about Dr. Nichols. And as an African-American man, brilliant. He talked about and taught me about this whole notion of cognitive dissonance and how one reconciles it, especially as it relates to oppressing other people. Because generally speaking, human beings struggle when you oppress people. You know, it's just a normal thing. It's just, you don't feel good about it, right? So how does one reconcile oppressing or subjugating an entire group of people? How does one reconcile that? And Dr. Nichols says, here's a formula, they can write it down, true of any group you oppress, whether it's women or people of color, you name the group. In order to remove the dissonance associated with that behavior, you have to first justify the behavior, which eases the mind, you see, and the conscience. But how you do it is what's so interesting. You must relabel the people to fit your behavior towards them. So then we can all go to sleep at night. So let's look at what old boy did here. This is what he said. He says, slaves are lesser creatures without Christian souls and thus are not destined for the next world. Look at, you see what we've done. He was experiencing dissonance. He reconciled that dissonance by saying, well, they don't have Christian souls anyway, which means that I am absolved. You see? Then he goes on to say, when the women and girls are taken on board ship, naked, trembling, terrified, they're often exposed to the wanton rudeness of white savages. The prey, interesting use of words, is divided upon the spot. Resistance or refusal would be utterly in vain. I sinned with a high hand. And then he found, okay, let's keep it clear. Then there's him, old Carl. We all know Carl, actually. We all took high school biology. You had to study Carl. Now, Carl becomes an important